Today you will hear the real story of Samir Khalil. He grew up in a Muslim home and was always known at the university for his defiant gaze and sharp words. The son of Lebanese parents, he grew up in a home without strong religious traditions in the United States. He was always surrounded by militant atheist friends who reinforced his conviction that the Christian faith was nothing more than cultural and political manipulation from the West. Intelligent, sarcastic, and proud of winning arguments, he made online debates his favorite stage, where he dismantled any argument that resembled religion. But behind that confidence, he carried a silent rage and wounds he never allowed to surface. What no one imagined was that Samir's quest for one more public victory would lead him to an unexpected confrontation with Kirk at an event in Texas, and that this moment would open the way for something he would never have believed possible: a sincere prayer, a supernatural visitation, a miracle. And to continue with this story, make sure you are already subscribed to the channel, like the video so that this message of faith can reach even more people, and take a moment to tell us in the comments from which city you are watching us.
I grew up believing that my mind was the only fortress I needed. I spent years immersed in dense books of philosophy, devouring each chapter as if they were weapons that gave me ammunition against any religious person who crossed my path. Anti-Christian podcasts became my daily soundtrack, faithful companions during study hours and even in college breaks. I listened to those firm voices that attacked the Christian faith and felt a strange pleasure, as if each argument made me more invincible, smarter, more prepared to unmask anyone who dared to speak of God near me. Online forums were my favorite battlefield. There I could be sarcastic, incisive, and I always left with the feeling of having won. It was not hate that moved me, at least not in the way many might think. It was arrogance. I wanted to feel that I was above, that I understood the world better than those who relied on something that, to me, was pure illusion. But the truth is that behind that veneer of confidence, there was a pain I kept under lock and key. I lost my older brother in a car accident when I was still in high school. That day was a deep wound that never healed. What marked me was not only the tragedy itself, but the words I heard afterward. Well-meaning people came to my family and said, "It was God's will." That burned inside me. How could a good God want the death of a young man full of life? How could there be love in such a cruel decision? Those phrases sounded to me like insults, like empty justifications for a pain no one could understand. It was then that my heart shut down for good. Revolt took the place of faith, and skepticism became my shield against any memory of fragility. At the university, that posture only intensified. I stood out in discussions, was invited to participate in academic debates, and everyone knew I would never miss a chance to mock any reference to Jesus or the Bible. The more I studied atheist and skeptical thinkers, the more convinced I became that I was on the right path. But deep down, I didn't realize that every argument I gathered was also a way to avoid facing the real pain I carried. I clung to logic so I would not have to deal with the emotional emptiness. I was proud of being feared in online discussions, of being respected by classmates as someone difficult to beat in debate. But alone in my room, the silence always reminded me of my brother's absence. It was in this state of constant self-assertion that one day I came across a digital poster announcing that Kirk would be in Houston for a public event. The name sounded familiar. I had already seen his videos on the internet, and to me he represented everything I despised: conservative, Christian, a staunch defender of values I considered outdated and even dangerous. The moment I read the announcement, my blood boiled. It felt like a personal call, almost like a providential opportunity. Not from God, because I didn't believe in him, but from fate. It was the chance to confront someone who symbolized exactly what I fought against. I did not hesitate. I was going. The preparation turned into obsession. I spent sleepless nights building a kind of intellectual arsenal. I watched and re-watched Charlie's videos, noting every phrase, every point that could be exploited and refuted. I delved into works by philosophers such as Nietzsche and Dawkins, looking for passages that could serve as ammunition. I put together a list of sharp questions, created rhetorical traps, rehearsed in front of the mirror how I should carry myself, even the dramatic pauses that would make my speech sound more powerful. It was almost as if I were preparing for war, and that stage would be my battlefield. In my imagination, I could already see the scene. Me standing before the audience, questioning Charlie with firmness, deconstructing his arguments, leaving the auditorium in silence, everyone recognizing the superiority of my words. I wanted more than to refute. I wanted to humiliate, to show that he was nothing more than another Christian trying to sell an illusion to naive people. That expectation fueled me, gave me energy. I felt that I would finally have the chance to transform all my pain, my arrogance, and my skepticism into a public victory. On the day of the event, when I entered the auditorium, everything seemed to conspire to confirm that feeling. The crowd applauding Charlie, the signs with Bible verses, the people with closed eyes praying in silence. To me, all of that was theater. I felt out of place, but at the same time excited by the idea of unmasking that collective hypocrisy in front of everyone. I sat in a corner with my notebook hidden in my backpack, my heart racing and my mind repeating each of the phrases I had rehearsed so many times. I did not see that moment as just a debate. I saw it as a battle that needed to be won, and I was certain that I would leave there as the great victor. And so it was, with my soul taken over by a mix of rage, pride, and expectation, that I waited patiently for the moment when I would have the microphone in my hands. I had no idea that this event would not be the stage of my victory, but the beginning of the greatest defeat of my arrogance, a defeat that would be transformed, in an unexplainable way, into liberation. The moment finally arrived. The microphone was being passed around the auditorium, and when it came near me, I raised my hand firmly. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the anticipation of finally putting into practice everything I had rehearsed. When I stood up, I felt the eyes turning toward me. It was as if I had conquered the stage before even opening my mouth. I took a deep breath and let my voice come out louder than I expected. I fired words loaded, sharp as blades. Christianity oppresses, manipulates history, and kills in the name of God. You speak of love, but the Crusades were bloody wars. You speak of forgiveness, but you imposed fear and destruction. How can you trust a faith that has brought so much pain to the world? My speech echoed strongly, provoking reactions in the audience. Some eyes filled with discomfort, others furrowed their brows in indignation. I felt satisfied. That was exactly what I had planned, to expose in front of everyone the supposed contradiction of the Christian faith. I was ready for the confrontation, for a verbal battle. I expected Charlie Kirk, that Christian activist, to strike back in the same tone, maybe even raise his voice, trying to impose authority over me. I expected him to accuse me, to call me ignorant, or to ridicule me in front of everyone. But what happened was something totally unexpected. Charlie listened to me in silence, looking directly into my eyes without blinking, without interrupting, without turning his face away. He waited for me to finish, and only then began to respond. But his response did not come loaded with attacks or aggressive defense. It came with calm. It came with patience. It came with something that, for me, was even more unbearable. Love. He began by saying that he understood my indignation, that indeed, the history of humanity was full of violence practiced in the name of God, but that this was not the gospel. He said that the Christian faith was not sustained by wars, but by forgiveness, not by manipulation, but by freedom. As he spoke, his voice did not tremble. He did not try to defeat me by volume, but by truth. And then came the phrase that changed everything, the phrase that struck me like a precise arrow. It is not by argument that a heart changes, but by the love of Christ who calls us by name. When I heard that, something inside me broke. I did not let it show. My face remained rigid, my expression hard. But inside, it was as if a wall had begun to crack. I had never heard anyone speak like that. I had never felt anyone respond to me with such serenity. Every time I attacked someone's faith, I received in return anger, disdain, or silence. But not that day. That day, I saw a man who did not see me as an enemy, but as someone who needed to be loved. I left the auditorium disturbed. It was not an intellectual defeat. I still had answers at the tip of my tongue, still believed I could build better arguments, that I could continue defending my convictions. But something inside me was shaken. It was as if that phrase would not stop echoing. It is not by argument that a heart changes. It is not by argument. I went home with my body tired, but my mind restless. That firm gaze of Charlie and the calm of his voice came back to my memory at every moment. In the days that followed, I tried to resume my routine, but nothing seemed to fit anymore. I opened the online forums and read the discussions, but I no longer felt the same excitement. The podcast that once set me ablaze with conviction now sounded repetitive, almost empty. It was as if the seed planted in that debate had begun to sprout, silent yet insistent. And along with that seed, the memory of my brother's death came back strongly. I saw myself once again before the coffin, remembering the words that wounded me. It was God's will. That throbbing pain which I had buried under layers of arrogance seemed to have been unearthed all at once. But this time, along with the pain came something new. Shame for the arrogant tone with which I spoke at the event, shame for the pleasure I felt in humiliating Christians in discussions, shame for realizing that perhaps I had turned my pain into a weapon against others. It was in this mix of feelings that, almost without realizing it, I began to look for something I never imagined seeking. I opened the Bible online, only out of curiosity, only to find inconsistencies and confirm my criticisms. I chose the Gospel of John because a professor at the university once commented that it was the most poetic and therefore the most vulnerable to philosophical critiques. I went in with the intention to refute, but as I read, something different happened. I was not just reading words. I felt that those sentences were looking back at me. When I came across the passage that said, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it," I fell silent. It seemed like an exact description of my life. I was the darkness that did not understand the light, and even so, there it was, insisting on shining. The nights became long. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep, remembering Charlie's serenity and the words that I was now reading in secret. I felt divided between the arrogance that screamed inside me and a curiosity I could not suppress. Till one early morning, exhausted from fighting against those thoughts, I sat on the floor of my room, turned off the lights, and hid my face in my hands. It was there that, almost unintentionally, the words came out of my mouth. It was not a beautiful prayer, nor rehearsed. It was a mix of irony and sincerity, as if my heart did not know exactly what it was asking. I said, "God, if you exist, prove me wrong." My voice came out trembling, almost ashamed, but in that moment, I realized that something inside me had given in. I, who had always ridiculed faith, was there, asking a God I claimed not to believe in to show me the truth. And it was exactly at that moment, in that unlikely request, that a crack opened inside of me. I did not know it yet, but that simple whisper would be the beginning of an even greater battle, where it would not be arguments at stake, but my very soul. That night, after days in which the silence seemed heavier than any noise, I locked myself in my room as one who shuts himself inside a battlefield. There was no music, no computer screen, nothing but the sound of my accelerated breathing. The request I had made days earlier, "God, if you exist, prove me wrong," still echoed inside me like an insolent challenge. But now it was different. I was no longer speaking only as someone who wanted to win an argument, but as someone who carried inside a void that no logical reasoning could fill. I sat on the floor, leaning against the bed, and covered my face with my hands. It was late at night, but sleep seemed impossible, and it was at that instant, in that profound silence, that something unexplainable happened. First, I felt a warmth that did not come from any physical place. It was not the heating of the room, nor the suffocating heat of Houston at that time of year. It was something that seemed to spring from inside me and at the same time envelop me from the outside. I looked around and realized that the brightness of the room had changed. It was not the dim light of the lamp I had turned off, nor the glow of the moon that sometimes came through the window. It was an intense, living light that did not hurt the eyes, but brought peace, a light that seemed to breathe along with me. I felt the air lighter, as if every particle around me had been purified. It was then that I heard. It was not a sound coming from outside, not a neighbor's voice, not an echo of memory. It was a gentle but firm voice, a voice that seemed to pass through my entire body. It said, "I was with you even in your pain. I did not come to take your brother. I came to give you life." Those words struck me as if they were rays of truth piercing every layer of hardness I had built over the years. I trembled. My body felt heavy, but at the same time my soul seemed light, as if it had been freed from a weight that had accompanied me since the tragedy of my brother's death. Falling to my knees was not a choice, it was almost a reflex. My legs did not hold me. There, on the floor of my room, I cried as I had never cried before. They were not tears of revolt, like those I had so often shed in silence. They were tears of liberation, as if each drop carried away years of resentment, arrogance, and pain. The phrase about my brother burned inside me in a strange way. For the first time, I felt that God had not been my enemy, that he had not been indifferent to my pain. I realized that while I screamed in rage at the sky, he was there, silent, waiting for the moment when I would finally make space to hear his voice. The crying mixed with a peace I did not know how to describe. I tried to think. I tried to reason, but there was no logic capable of explaining that experience. It was more real than any argument I had ever used, more true than any debate I had ever won. I remembered every time I had put myself as judge of the Christian faith, pointing out supposed errors, mocking the Bible. Now, on my knees, with my face wet with tears, all of that seemed so small, so fragile before that presence that enveloped me. I spent what seemed like an eternity there on the floor. Time seemed to have stopped. I do not know if it was minutes or hours. I only know that each second marked me in a way that human words cannot express. When the light began to fade, I felt a momentary emptiness, like someone waking from a dream too vivid. But soon came the certainty. That had not been imagination. It had not been hallucination. I knew I had heard a real voice. I knew I had been visited by something greater than myself, and above all, I knew I would never be the same again. In the days that followed, my heart could no longer return to its previous state. Everything seemed different. Walking down the street, looking at people, even listening to trivial conversations around me, everything carried a different weight. But along with that new perception came the first consequences. My university friends, those with whom I had spent hours in online forums attacking faith, realized that something had changed. When I began to withdraw from discussions and refused to take part in certain debates, they began to question. At first, they laughed, thinking I was just tired. Later, they began to accuse me of being deceived, of having fallen into some psychological trap. I heard from people I considered brothers in the journey phrases such as, "You are weak, Khalil. You have lost the firmness of reason. They are manipulating you." Those words hurt, but they were not strong enough to erase what I had experienced. I already knew it was not manipulation. I had experienced something that no one could take away from me. Even harder was telling my mother. I remember the night I sat before her, unable to look into her eyes, and said that something had happened to me. I explained that I had felt a presence, heard a voice, that I was drawing near to Christianity. Tears ran down her face, but they were not of emotion. They were of despair. She said I was betraying our heritage, our history, that I was spitting on the roots of our family. "You do not know what this means," she repeated, her voice breaking. "You do not understand the weight of abandoning who you are." My heart broke. I loved her, and the last thing I wanted was to hurt her. But at the same time, I could not deny what had happened. I had not chosen that experience. I had been reached. The relationship at home became tense. My mother's silence was heavy, my father's words harsh. I no longer felt welcomed under the roof that had always been my home, and even so, a flame burned inside me, reminding me of the peace I felt in the room that night. That flame was what kept me standing. I repeated to myself, "I heard the voice, I know what happened, I cannot deny it." In the midst of that turmoil, I found an unlikely refuge. Near the campus, there was a small church, simple, almost hidden among shops and old buildings. For days I passed by without courage to enter, until one Sunday morning with a heavy heart I decided to cross the door. The place was simple, without great apparatus, without the spectacle I had so often criticized in religious speeches, but the people there had something that caught my attention: sincerity. It was not perfection, it was not appearance. It was a real community, made of ordinary people, but who carried in their eyes a peace similar to the one I had felt in my room. I sat in the back, trying not to draw attention. The pastor spoke about transformation, about how God can rescue even those who consider themselves too far gone. It was as if he were describing my life exactly. When the service ended, an elderly woman approached me, offered me a coffee, and asked if I was all right. That simple gesture, so small, was enough to break my last barriers. I cried in front of her, unable to explain clearly, only repeating, "I saw Jesus." He spoke to me. She was not startled. She simply smiled tenderly, as if she had already heard that kind of story many times. It was there, in that small church, that for the first time I shared my testimony, not with pride, but with vulnerability. I spoke about the pain of losing my brother, about the arrogance that guided me, about the debate with Charlie Kirk, about the night I heard the voice that said, "I was with you even in your pain. I did not come to take your brother. I came to give you life." Every word that left my mouth seemed to bring relief, as if speaking were a way of continuing to be healed. For the first time I realized that I was not alone, that there was a community ready to welcome me even when the world outside rejected me. That first time I told my story did not erase the suspicious looks from my friends, nor the painful silence from my family. But inside me, something was decided. I could never go back. The weight I had carried for so many years had been lifted. I was no longer the same man who walked into that auditorium in Houston with a heart full of pride. I had been touched, marked, and transformed by an experience that defied all my logic. And no matter how much resistance I faced, I knew this was only the beginning of a path I could not abandon. When I accepted the invitation to join a small youth group on a Thursday night, my heart was still full of fear. I did not know exactly what to expect. It was a simple gathering, held in an improvised meeting room next to the church. The chairs were plastic. There was a wooden table in the corner with some open Bibles, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. I sat among young people I hardly knew, but I noticed something different in their eyes. There was no judgment, no suspicion. Their looks conveyed peace, hope, and above all, a kind of human warmth I had not felt in years. When they asked if I would like to share something, my first instinct was to refuse. The shame and fear of being misunderstood still lingered around me, but something inside pushed me to open my mouth. My hands were sweating. My voice came out shaky, but I began to speak. I told them who I was before everything, an arrogant young man who thought himself superior because he knew philosophers, books, and theories, a young man who made revolt his banner, who carried in his heart a wound left open by the death of a brother, and who used that pain as fuel to attack anyone who mentioned God. I told them I was proud of being seen as someone hard to beat in a debate, someone sarcastic and cold, someone who fed on online discussions and hid behind logic to avoid facing his own pain. And when I looked around, I saw that no one laughed. No one looked at me with contempt. On the contrary, I saw teary eyes. I saw heads nodding as if they truly understood. Then I went further into the story and spoke about the day I decided to confront Charlie Kirk in public. I explained how I entered that auditorium thirsty for victory, prepared to humiliate a Christian in front of hundreds of people. I recounted the harsh phrases I fired, the arrogant tone, the satisfaction I felt throwing accusations about wars, crusades, and historical manipulation in his face. But I also shared what happened afterward, when I heard from Charlie not the aggressive response I expected, but a calm, patient reply centered on love, forgiveness, and freedom. I repeated to that group the phrase that broke my resistance. It is not by argument that a heart changes, but by the love of Christ who calls us by name. When I spoke those words, my voice faltered. I myself could not pronounce them without feeling a knot in my throat. I continued, describing the sleepless nights, the shame that began to consume me, the secret reading of the Gospel of John done almost as an exercise in rebellion, but which in practice opened a door inside me that would never again be closed. And then, with tears streaming down my face, I spoke of the experience in my room, the intense light, the gentle voice that told me, "I was with you, even in your pain. I did not come to take your brother. I came to give you life." When I finished that part, silence filled the room. Some cried, others simply closed their eyes as if praying silently. I took a deep breath and said the sentence that summed up my entire journey to that point. I discovered that I did not need more arguments but an encounter, And that encounter changed everything. Hearing my own voice speaking those words, I felt as if I were finally declaring the truth before everyone. It was not about winning or losing debates. It was not about proving who was right or wrong. It was about something much greater, something that transcends logic and touches the heart. I no longer had doubts. What transformed me was not a well-constructed reasoning, but the real presence of Jesus who entered my life when I least expected it. The young people around me began to pray. Some came closer, placed their hands on my shoulders, and once again, I felt that peace that had enveloped me in my room. A peace that did not depend on circumstances, but that grew stronger every time I spoke about what I had lived through. A few days later, walking alone through the city, my steps led me back to the place where it had all begun. The auditorium where Charlie Kirk had been was not full this time. It was silent, with the parking lot almost empty. But as I approached, I felt a wave of memories flood over me. I remembered the clothes I wore, the exact place where I sat, the moment when I raised my hand in arrogance. I closed my eyes for a moment, and it seemed as if I could hear my own voice again, challenging, accusing, attacking. But immediately afterward came to mind the calm of Charlie's gaze, the serenity of his words, and above all, the impact that it had on my soul. I leaned against the car and stood there, still observing the building that once to me had represented a battlefield and now was a landmark of transformation. I no longer looked with hatred. I no longer felt the urge to prove anything. On the contrary, what I felt was gratitude. Gratitude for that day that in my eyes had seemed like a trap for Christians, but in truth was the beginning of my new life. I smiled to myself with tears welling in my eyes and whispered softly, "Thank you, Jesus, for finding me here." It was as if the silent auditorium were a mute witness to a battle won not with arguments, but with love. And so, in that moment, I understood once and for all that every detail, every confrontation, every tear shed had led me to that place. The place that should have been the stage of my personal victory became, in truth, the setting of the beginning of my defeat before pride and the birth of a faith I never imagined experiencing. That scene never left my memory, and every time I pass by there, I feel again the weight of what I lived, but also the lightness of what I received. And that memory continues to accompany me, reminding me every day of where it all began and where this new journey is leading me.
As we follow each step of Samir's journey, from intellectual arrogance to the supernatural encounter that changed his life, we are reminded that no one is ever too far to be reached by the grace of God. Pain, revolt, and even the greatest barriers of the heart can be broken when the light of Christ invades the darkness. This is not just the story of one young man, but a reflection of what God is still doing in the lives of thousands of people around the world. And if you have made it this far, it is because this message also spoke to your heart. So, before you leave, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, so you will not miss any of the upcoming testimonies we have lovingly prepared. Also, leave your like, because that helps this video reach even more people who need to hear about the hope in Jesus. And if you truly followed until the end, write in the comments, "I love Jesus." It will be a beautiful way for us to declare this truth together and spread this message of love even further. And do not forget, right here beside you, the next video is already appearing, a living testimony of faith and hope that will deeply impact your heart. Click right now and continue with us on this journey of transformation. God bless you, and see you in the next video.